Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's event on fossil fuel subsidy reform. I'm a new face on the climate change scene. My name is Mark Sinclair. I'm currently New Zealand ambassador to Japan, but I'm in the process of taking over from Joe Tyndall, who'll be known to many of you, as New Zealand climate change ambassador. And I'm chairing today's event as representative of a group of countries who are the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. I'm going to make a few opening remarks, then I'm going to introduce our expert panelists who will be providing the substance for today's event, and then we'll launch into it. We've got, as I say, lots of substance to come from the three panelists. At the end of their presentations, we'll have an opportunity for questions and discussion. I'm sure their presentations will generate lots of interest and lots of questions. Before we go further, I'm going to ask Laura to say a word about how to access the live feed.
Side event has taken advantage of the UNFCCC offering to open this up to the rest of the world, which means it's being live streamed. And so online audience can participate and ask questions by sending a tweet to @UNFCCC_CC Studio. The name of the Twitter account can also be found in the description of the broadcasted video of your side event at the YouTube channel of UNFCCC Climate Change Studio. So if you are listening online and you'd like to ask questions, we will be able to get some of those and put them to the panel. There are also some sign-up sheets at the end of the chairs. So for people who would like to keep in touch, for us to keep a track of the kind of impacts that we're having and people we're talking to. So if you'd be willing to sign those up at the sign-up sheets, that would be very helpful as well. Thanks.
Okay, I mentioned that I'm chairing this meeting as a representative of the Friends Group. Last year, the Friends Group launched the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform communique at the annual World Bank Springs meeting in April. Friends Group members, and we're a group of non-G20 countries, includes Costa Rica, Denmark, Ethiopia, Finland, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland. That's as of last year. With the support of the Global Subsidies Initiative, at that time, the communique was also supported by the United States and France. Since then, we've been delighted to have Uruguay, under the leadership of Ambassador Mendes, who will be known to many of you, also joined the Friends Group. That communique was handed over by world leaders to UNFCCC Executive Secretary Christiana Figueres at COP21 in Paris in November last year. And the aim of that was to support efforts to reach a new global climate agreement. Those of you who followed it will know that the event received a lot of media attention. In fact, the Friends social media campaign, I think, reached about 2 million accounts. By the end of 2015, the communique had gained endorsement from 40 countries and 6 of the 7 G7 members. It also secured the support and backing of business associations representing close to 15,000 businesses and investors, as well as a wide range of NGOs and international organizations. Today's event, we're obviously in a post-Paris environment, looking at how to deliver on the commitments we've taken on. Today's event is hosted by the NAP Global Network, by the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, and by the Global Subsidies Initiative. And as Laura said, the meeting is being live webcast via the UNFCCC YouTube link. Our full theme for today is financing adaptation and resilience through fossil fuel subsidy reform and fuel duty. Let me just say a word by way of introduction on that expanded theme. As we know, the Paris Agreement establishes a global adaptation goal that requires parties, as appropriate, to engage in adaptation planning and implementation. And this may include the formulation and implementation of national adaptation plans, which are means of identifying adaptation needs and developing measures to address them. These are, it goes without saying, important vehicles for enabling the transition to climate resilient societies. But, there's always a but, how are we going to fund what's in these plans? How are we going to fund this transition? And how can we do that at the same time as we invest in reducing emissions? Above all, how can we de-link ourselves from growth, excuse me, growth based on carbon, and shift towards growth and investment based on socially and environmentally efficient investments? To give you a sense of the context, fossil fuel subsidies currently run at around 600 billion US dollars per year. Of that, about 500 billion takes the form of consumer subsidies, but there is a further 100 billion in producer subsidies. Those subsidies, it goes without saying, are simply huge. That 600 billion is 6 times the level of climate finance that we've committed to raise under our Paris obligations. They could take us a long way towards funding climate adaptation and resilience needs if we were able to redirect them towards renewables and adaptation. I'd have to add that while that's a huge sum, at the same time there has been good progress towards reform in many countries. Without the reforms adopted since 2009, the value of fossil fuel subsidies would have been perhaps 24% higher than they are today. That's an extra 117 billion that has been saved through reforms over that period. So countries are making good progress on fossil fuel subsidy reform. But can nations build for the future also through introduction of fuel duties or levies to help bring in regular funding to support government needs? So we'll look today not only at fossil fuel subsidies, but also the potential from taxation on fossil fuels and how they might be channeled to support the implementation of adaptation. We see these two tracks, subsidy reform and future changes in taxation on fossil fuels, as entirely complementary. We'll be asking a number of questions here today to the panelists, and then we'll open up the floor, as I said, for questions. I'm just going to run through the questions that we've identified for the 3 panelists, and then I'll introduce them before they get their presentations underway. First to Anne Hammill on my far left from IISD. We're going to be asking, what's the scale and size needed in terms of adaptation and resilience finance moving forwards? What are the examples of resilience activities that could be funded from domestic resources liberated through fossil fuel subsidy reform or through revenues generated from a fuel duty? And how can networks like NAP Global Network help bring governments together in terms of peer-to-peer learning or financing for development? From Andrea Mesa from Costa Rica on my left. Why and how did Costa Rica remove subsidies to fossil fuels? How and where did it introduce fuel duty? And how are some of these funds utilised for adaptation or resilience funding? And then finally from Laura Merrill of the IISD's GSI, opportunities for domestic financing and mitigation savings from fossil fuel subsidy reform, from fuel duty to reflect carbon and social pollution costs, and concrete examples of action. Let's get right into it. I'm going to begin by introducing Anne Hammill, who is Director of the IISD's Resilience Program, which works on policies, tools, and research needed to help societies anticipate, withstand and recover from shocks and stresses. Much of her work focuses on helping governments and civil society embed risk management into planning processes with a focus on climate and conflict-related risks. Anne's most recent work has been on examining national adaptation planning process in developing countries and how it can best support climate resilient development. In 2015, the Resilience Program became the Secretariat for the NAP Global Network, which aims to enhance national adaptation planning and action in developing countries through coordination of bilateral support and in-country actors. Without further ado, Anne, could we turn to you? Thank you.
Thanks very much. So as we just heard, I'm going to be answering a couple of questions over the next few minutes of my presentation. And really what I want to be able to achieve, and hopefully you'll walk away with a better understanding of, is two things. So one is just a really brief introduction to the NAP Global Network, which, as we just heard, is really a network that's focusing on enhancing national adaptation planning and implementation. And then kind of delve into one of the topics that we've started exploring through the network and some of the peer exchange activities that we've undertaken over the last year. And that is specifically mobilizing domestic resources to fund the implementation of NAPs, or National Adaptation Plans. And then, of course, we'll transition on the rest of the panel to specifically looking at fiscal instruments like subsidy reform and fuel duty. So yeah, the NAP Global Network. So just quickly to give you a snapshot of what it's about. The network was established in 2014 by a group of bilateral donors and representatives from developing country governments. And at the time and since then, the importance of the national adaptation planning process has been increasing, both within the context of the negotiations and outside. And so this has been associated also with increased levels of support for the NAP process, particularly in developing countries. And so with more attention and activity around NAP processes, more resources flowing to support NAP processes, the need for coordination has just been increasing. And on top of that, as we're learning more from NAP processes, there is a real need, we think, to have more technical discussions around the process itself. So not just who's up to what, who's where in their process, but really what are some of the specific technical challenges and opportunities that different countries are encountering. And we didn't know that, there was a feeling that there wasn't necessarily a space for this at the time. And so that was one of the rationales for establishing the network and to really focus on peer exchange and learning. The goal of the network is to enhance bilateral support for national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. And the emphasis here that's worth pulling out is on bilateral support, largely because it does represent the majority of adaptation-related ODA finance. As I said, it was established in 2014 in Lima. Initial financing and support is provided by the governments of Germany and the US, and the Secretariat is hosted by IISD. Quickly on the objectives, Laura, could you just go back? Yeah, quickly on the objectives and activities. There's three objectives and corresponding activity areas. As I mentioned, I won't go into any detail really on these areas, but just worth highlighting that one of the objectives, as I mentioned, was improving coordination amongst bilaterals who are providing support to the NAP process, but also between bilaterals and developing countries, both at a global level and in country themselves. Another objective is supporting national level action on NAP development and implementation, and that might take form of organizing specific coordination meetings in a country, offering targeted technical support. And then last but not least, and this is what I'm going to be focusing on, is a really big emphasis of the NAP Global Network is facilitating peer learning and exchange. And one of the main vehicles for doing this is something that's called the Targeted Topics Forum, where we gather a group of 8 to 10 developing countries and a number of donors together. We established 2 classes where these countries and donors will meet regularly, at least once a year, to really unpack and delve into a specific technical issue related to NAPs. And this year, a cohort of countries that had met for the first time last year in Brazil got together in Jamaica in March and looked at this issue of financing NAPs, options for implementation. Now, the reason for focusing on this issue, I mean, obviously, climate finance, adaptation finance is always a hot topic. And then the feeling with the group of countries on the NAPs, and the discussions we were having, is that there was a real desire to make sure that we didn't allow discussions to focus only on planning. We really want to make sure we got to the implementation piece and really unpack what that meant. And there's been research undertaken, and reports have been coming out in the lead up to Paris and since Paris about the scale of adaptation finance needed, the gap. UNEP's adaptation gap report, for example, provides some of these estimates. And here we've got it listed, what's in that report. And here we've got the current gap as being, the current cost of adaptation as being around between $56 to $73 billion a year. And they see that increasing in scale, that by 2050, the adaptation costs, the needs, will be between $280 to $500 billion a year. Now that's just the estimates that are in the adaptation gap report. And of course, there are all sorts of issues around methodologies and what's counted, but that gives you a ballpark figure. Now, one thing to also flag in this is that the gap that's calculated between how much it's going to cost, how much adaptation is going to cost, and what's available, only looks at a small segment of finance flows, and that's specifically the international public adaptation finance. And what's not counted in this is flows coming from private sector, and then of course domestic public sector contributions. And I highlight that because that was one piece of the adaptation finance discussions that we didn't want to miss, particularly in the targeted topics forum that we had in Jamaica. Laura? And the theme that really kind of framed, I think, our discussions in Jamaica was, okay, so there's this need for adaptation finance. The need is going to increase. There is a gap. The size of that gap might be up for discussion, but there is a gap. And there's going to be flows that are going to be coming in, whether it's the mobilization of the 100 billion or whether we start better counting for private sector finance flows, or whether it's domestic flows. But there's going to be more money coming into adaptation. And so you need to be ready for this. And this is where NAPs play a critical role. National adaptation plans are a high-level statement of vision, intent, and political commitment on adaptation. And they offer medium to long-term strategic investment plans, articulating needs and priorities. So they give some direction on where the flows of investment that are coming in for adaptation, whether they're domestically mobilized or internationally mobilized, where they should be going to meet adaptation priorities and needs. In short, they influence the allocation of internal and external resources. And part of making sure that NAPs can be really effective and help countries move from the planning to implementation is trying to figure out a strategy of combining and sequencing different sources of finance. I'm not going to go into detail of this, but this is just to give you sort of an idea of how we map the different sources of finance and what countries should be looking at when they're thinking about the entire landscape of finance available for implementing adaptation. International, domestic, public, private, it can take various forms. This isn't exhaustive, and you could probably shift some of these in between categories. But what we did want to do in our targeted topics forum in Jamaica was make sure that we were going to capture that lower left-hand quadrant on domestic public resources, that it wasn't all about GCF, it wasn't all about the vertical funds on adaptation, that there's a role to be played by domestic budgets, and we should be looking at domestic resource mobilization opportunities. And traditionally, this hasn't been a strong focus. Unsurprisingly, the countries that are most in need of adapting don't necessarily have strong domestic revenue streams. That said, we're seeing moves to allocate resources from subsidy removal, for example, fuel duty, and we'll hear some case studies later on in this panel of how these kinds of domestic resources and this domestic resource space that's opened up can be used to fund things like infrastructure projects, climate resilient infrastructure projects, social protection programs, which can be absolutely critical to building a country's resilience and helping them adapt. And then things like ecosystem-based adaptation, and I believe that's what we're going to be hearing from Costa Rica. You can also see that maybe the resources that are made more available from fossil fuel subsidy reform in developed countries, perhaps a certain percentage of that can be allocated to supporting adaptation in developing countries. So NAPs can create a space to explore these opportunities. Laura, sorry. And so I just want to end by saying, watch the space. These are conversations that we started having within the context of the NAP Global Network at the Targeted Topics Forum. And we're now trying to tease out the fiscal instruments angle of adaptation finance and how these fiscal instruments can support the implementation of national adaptation plans. There are definitely challenges and opportunities related to this, and there's a lot to be learned, I think, from countries as they start getting more active in this space, and there's already a lot of lessons that we can be learning from the mitigation experiences as well. And one of the themes that was flagged a few times in the conversations that this isn't just about developing countries raising resources themselves so they could just do adaptation themselves. This is also about mobilizing domestic resources to better position themselves for other types of finance as well. So for example, maybe it'll strengthen the case for accessing international public finance, because domestic resources can be a demonstration of ownership, counterpart financing, co-financing, etc. And just going to end by saying that this issue of understanding the opportunities of just domestic resource mobilization and the importance of it in adaptation implementation, it reinforces the importance of tracking and building capacity for domestic resource mobilization. And it's a much more comprehensive picture that we need to be looking at when we look at different options for adaptation finance. And I'll end it at that.
And thank you for that. I think Anne's given us a great global scale scene setter, setting out very clearly both the nature of the challenge and how fossil fuel subsidy reform and indeed fossil fuel taxation is potentially a very important part of the solution to adaptation financing needs, and indeed a wider range of public policy needs. To illuminate at a practical level what can be done and indeed what has been done, we're going to turn to the Costa Rican example. Andrea Meta is Director of the Climate Change Office at the Costa Rican Ministry of Environment and Energy. Before her current position, she worked for more than 15 years as an international consultant in sustainable development and climate change projects for the IDB, the European Union, and for several governments in Latin America. She's a lawyer with a master's degree in local development. As part of her responsibilities, she has to promote the implementation of the current national strategy on climate change and its associated action plan. She has to lead the negotiation for the adoption of mitigation and adaptation goals with sectoral ministries such as transport, agriculture, housing and finance, and the promotion of a new national climate governance. Amidst all those responsibilities, she's taken time out to join us for this event today. So, Andrea, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity of being here and sharing this experience. What we're seeing and the way Costa Rica is approaching all this idea of fossil fuels subsidies and reforms is that we really see a link between mitigation and adaptation measures. And I think that's very important to consider when we're seeing these approaches. We really think that with some of these specific measures in what you think will be mitigation issues or areas, which is fossil fuels, for example, with all those revenues, you can really come and start and implementing those adaptation strategies. Laura, the next please. Just a quick view of our emissions. We see that 44% of our emissions right now comes from the transport sector. And we see this as a big issue. Now, this comes because the way our cities are getting bigger, urban sprawl, and all these problems that I think that most of developing countries are facing are really generating all these emissions. So we are seeing and thinking about what could be our strategy to face this. And definitely in the area of fossil fuel subsidies, we see a big area to work and face these problems. Most of the emissions from transport come from all these different light duty and heavy duty type of transports. And the next, please. And we don't have that much problem with the energy because more than 90% of our energy is generated with renewable sources. So we don't have a problem there. We have a problem in the transport sector, certainly. And right now, what we're see is, okay, how are we going to face all these problems of the fleet increase, for example, which has been increased more than 85% in the last 15 years. I mean, these are big numbers. We see that our middle class is really using the car, and we must face all these issues. And we also have a problem with the old technology, the type of cars that we're using. And next, please. And it was in 2001 that we passed a law, and we established this tax for these fuels. And it has been a very important source of revenues for the government. And I think that what is interesting here to see is that with these revenues, for example, we're using more than, 60% of these revenues that we're generating from this tax, they go to the Ministry of Finance, and we definitely have a lot of necessities, and they use it in different areas. But 29% of this, that goes to the National Road Council to build roads, of course, and 3.5% of these revenues are allocated in the National Forestry Finance Fund, what we call FONAFIFO. And within FONAFIFO, it's really like the key institution that we have to do a lot of the work and the proof work that we're doing in our forestry sector. It's the instrument that we're using to do this scheme of payment for environmental services. And it's a payment that we give to the local properties, the owners of the land and the owners of the forest. And this has been a key, very important strategy in our forestry sector. And the other 1% of these revenues are allocated for our public university, for example, so for public educational purposes. So with this, in the FONAFIFO, within the FONAFIFO, or the all these revenues are now going to these strategies. And in our NDC, we establish, or we're using this approach of ecosystem-based adaptation, focus on forest and water protection. So these FONAFIFO's revenues are very important right now to get to the targets that we have in our NDCs, for example, in the adaptation areas. We're protecting critical areas for water sources. We're working a lot with local communities to do this job of protection of these sources of very important in water issues related, and also in biodiversity. So there's a lot of integrated measures that we are using and that we are funding with these revenues. But the interesting thing that we're seeing, Laura, next, please, is what we're thinking for the future. And next, I think the other one again, please. Is that we are, as I was mentioning in my previous ideas, is that we really need to do something now with this transport problem that we have. So we are discussing right now this idea of creating an emission fee for these mobile sources. It will be more a distance-based charge scheme that we are analyzing right now, have to be implemented. And we are not talking about a tax, because if we talk about a tax, then we will have to go to the Congress, and it's a long time. You never know. You know what goes into the Congress, and you never know what goes out of the Congress. So we're really thinking about using a fee. With a fee, we don't have to go to the Congress. And the idea is also to have a new income of sources, and the idea will be to use these revenues in the creation of better public transport infrastructure, and public transport investments, and sustainable mobility as well. So the idea is now, if we really come and establish this new fee, then we will be having new sources to also create these new solutions of public transport. And we also see public transport also as an adaptation measure. One way or the other, our cities are getting bigger, and normally we have this low income population who is really facing all these horrible situations of a really bad public transport and all these problems that we're having in the city. So this is the ideas that we're discussing right now as this new strategy. And just this last reflection of seeing really always this link that we see with mitigation and adaptation measures in our countries. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you for that. I think, I mean, Costa Rica is just one country example. I think it's a very good example, not least because, as we've heard in a very compelling way, this is an example of integrated and holistic policy and planning, achieving results that will serve quite a range of key public policy objectives, not least within those delivering on Costa Rica's goals and commitments under its NDC as part of the Paris Agreement implementation. So thank you for that presentation. We're going to turn finally to Laura Merrill, who's Senior Researcher and Operations Manager at the Global Subsidies Initiative, which is part of the work program of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Laura is a practitioner, policy advisor, and economist in energy, climate change, gender, and sustainable development. She is widely published on the issue of fossil fuel subsidies and taxation, including books published in 2015, Tackling Fossil Fuel Subsidies and Climate Change, which is published by the Nordic Council of Ministers, and on resource taxation in the book The Greatest Invention, Tax and the Campaign for a Just Society, which was published by Commonwealth Publishing. Laura studied politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford, has a master's degree in sustainable development and an MBA in international organizations from the University of Geneva. She has worked across East Africa with Oxfam as their regional fair trade coordinator, and has also worked with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature on payment for ecosystem services, and finally with energy, networked and regulated companies whilst with the Oxford Economic Research Associates, Oxera. Laura, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to focus a bit more. We've heard quite a lot about adaptation, and then the very practical issues of thinking through domestic finance and finding how to bring it together for adaptation funding from Andrea and from Anne. So thank you for that. I'm going to look at, do three things today. First, we're going to look at the financial impact of removing subsidies, and as well as their climate mitigation impact. Secondly, we're going to look at fuel duty. Again, I agree very much with Andrea. Try not to call things a tax. Call them a fee or a duty, and maybe they'll fly. So for both for finances, but again, also for mitigation. And third, we're going to take a look at some real life examples of how countries have been trying to raise finance through some of these instruments. And it really is a kind of progression. And this slide shows, in a way, about sort of getting your energy policy coherent with your climate policy. The first step is really about removing subsidies. Globally, we think this could give us around 6 to 13% emissions reductions by 2050 against business as usual. Can also save governments, this is the Nordic research, around $93 per tonne of CO2 abated, which is very impressive. The next thing is to look at basic fuel taxes, but these, again, could be as simple as VAT, a GST, small excise duty on usually gasoline or diesel. The next step is thinking about the broader social costs that society bears through pollution or accidents or congestion, and putting a carbon tax on top of some of these fuels. With a combination of all these three, you could get to around 23% reductions just from this policy instrument by 2050. And some, in a world where after the financial crisis, governments are very strapped for cash, IMF have estimated around 2.6% of global GDP could be raised in this way, moving forwards, these combinations of fiscal instruments and government policies. And the main thing to point out here is, I sometimes liken this to smoking. It's like giving people, fossil fuel subsidies are a bit like giving people free cigarettes, or even paying people to smoke cigarettes. And what you're doing is the opposite. I mean, we all learned over time that smoking was bad for your health. And we all understood over time that in order to pay for governments to pay for the health costs or to put people off smoking, you increase the cost of cigarettes, and this hopefully puts people off smoking. And you combine it with regulations as well to stop people selling cigarettes to young people and so on and so forth. But this is sort of the same process that's got to happen with fossil fuels. If we know fossil fuels are bad for our health, and I mean literally our lungs, but also for our, from a carbon perspective for the world, then we need to stop subsidizing these fuels. At the moment, we're subsidizing about 15% CO2 emissions, and we need to put a carbon price to sort of put consumers and businesses off using fossil fuels a lot. At the moment, only 8% of emissions have a positive carbon price. So we have to sort of change the direction. And at the moment, we are also spending around, these subsidies around 4 times the size we spend on renewables. So again, this has got to be a complete shift of finance across if we're going to have this transition to sort of a sustainable and future. The other reason why subsidies are really pernicious is because they're not really helping poor people at all. They do the opposite. They end up going to rich people. Of every $100 governments spend on subsidies, 93% go to the top 3 quintiles. Very little gets down to the bottom quintile, the poorest of the poor. So if you're thinking about adaptation, thinking about the sustainable development goals, this is a really poor welfare policy tool. It's had its time, and now we need to move on to much more targeted interventions around social protection, targeted energy subsidies, especially for gasoline. I mean, poor people get very, very little of those benefits. So as was pointed out, this is happening now. These subsidies are being removed in part because, as we saw with Costa Rica, it really is about a fiscal issue. It's about saving money, and it's possible to do this within the low oil price, but it would be, there is an opportunity when governments are making these decisions that it isn't just about saving budgets, and that there are national debates about where savings go and how they can be invested in adaptation and resilience. It's an important source of funding. It's 4 times the amount of aid that the OECD spend every year. So this is a big chunk of finance that we ought to be looking at carefully. It's not only about raising finance, there are reductions. We did research with the Nordic Council of Ministers. If you want to know more about this, this is the report we published last year for Paris, and there are some little postcards over there, so you can read more. But basically, we looked at 20 countries and we did 2 things. We phased out fossil fuel subsidies by 2020 to see what kind of savings we get and emissions reductions we get. It was around 11% across just 20 countries. And then we did something else. We decided, well, but governments need to have fiscal savings, fair enough, but let's put 30% of the savings into renewables and energy efficiency. Let's put 50% into social measures to counter any increase in prices. And this improves our emissions reductions to around 18%. So it really is thinking through how governments use the liberated savings to go into adaptation and resilience. And that starts a conversation with countries who can then include this within their planning and thinking moving forwards. These were the countries that we did the research across, and we've had conversations with many of them and gone into more modelling work with them to see about mitigation impacts in light of the nationally determined contributions, but also recent research that's coming out soon, for example, with Indonesia, who have had huge savings from their recent reforms in gasoline and diesel, and have had a very broad nationwide discussion about where some of those savings go. But there's another point here, and we should reflect on this, because it's not, as Anne said, it's not just about domestic finance. You know, the G20 are still spending around 70 billion every year on upstream producer subsidies. And if we really are spending that little, 5 billion a year on adaptation finance at the moment, then, you know, there are ways of finding this money and using it from money that's being used into fossil fuels, into adaptation and resilience. Not only in a domestic setting to go back into your own communities, your infrastructure, your transport systems, your healthcare, or your education, but also in terms of your external donor financing. So the G20 should consider, when going through these changes and reducing subsidies at home on fossil fuels, putting some of that, putting that more into their pledge and back into countries to adapt to countries that have to bear the brunt of these climate shocks. So I'm coming now quickly to taxation. So I've sort of discussed about the subsidy issue, because this is the next step. I mean, sometimes it happens together. Sometimes people are taxing and subsidizing in other places, but in an ideal world and a coherent strategy would be from one to the next. This IMF research finds that if governments properly taxed fossils, they would be saving just over 20% of CO2 and reducing global air pollution deaths by 55%. So this is the real driver now. It's to do with people's health within cities from overuse of fuels and overuse of coal and diesel that's causing people to become ill in cities. And those health costs need to be properly taken into account. And that's why these fuels should be properly taxed. Often these kind of fuels, these kind of taxes will then be more progressive, because it's richer people who own cars or air conditioning units, and therefore will more likely be able to afford these taxes than poorer people who don't have access to private mobility. We're going to dig into this a little bit, especially on coal, actually. Coal is really, at the moment, you know, people will say, oh, well, coal doesn't really have any subsidies in terms of finances, but coal is really undertaxed. Can you see? Yes, just about. So the small diamonds show where the current price or tax of the fuel of coal is across some countries here, and it's sort of bang on the middle. Where the little diamond is a negative number, it's sort of displaying a subsidy. It's beneath the international price, and the 0 is the international price. And then where people have put corrective taxes on top are the bars moving forward. The grey ones for local pollutions and the clear ones for carbon. So the idea is to try and move the diamond to fit with where the appropriate taxation level is. And coal it has huge carbon, it has carbon emitting potential, so it's not being taxed properly from its potential to emit carbon. That's the first thing. But it also has huge local pollution, air pollution impacts, and those social costs are not being captured either. So there's, again, an opportunity to tax there. Natural gas is less so, but coal is the point here. The other area that's important, and I think this is the main one, what we come to with subsidies and taxation generally, it's what people recognize and accept, is around gasoline and diesel. And especially I'm going to just focus quickly on diesel, because in Europe, we've seen what's happened with the differential between prices between, say, gasoline and diesel, with diesel being subsidized. But whole big consumer shift to diesel cars, and now we realize they have health problems. So those subsidies need to go, and you can see that those diamonds need to move up at least to the middle ground on diesel, and then be recognizing things such as local air pollution, carbon, congestion, and so on. So this is all about really just getting government policy coherent. First, start with the fossil fuel subsidies. They depress investment in energy efficiency. They bring about more domestic resources. They encourage innovation because they allow for higher prices, which means there's more innovation. They're the opposite of carbon pricing and taxation. They can be used to, savings can be used to invest in public transport, as we're hearing the thinking is going in Costa Rica. And you can turn some of those funds towards renewable energy and energy efficiency directly. And countries are recognizing this, they're reforming, and they're also seeing their fiscal instruments as part of their overall climate plan. And 13, some of those countries we spoke with directly are starting to figure out, well, how does this fit with our renewables target, our forestry target, our payment for ecosystems target, and so on. I would say it's the bedrock. You need the regulations and the targets, but you also need the right policy environment. And to get that policy environment is sort of a foundation for all these other elements on top of it. 39 countries talking about carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidies altogether, 13 on fossil fuel subsidy reform alone in their INDCs. This is research we did at the end of last year. Quickly then, so I'm just reiterating to say that this is a low international energy prices provide a window of opportunity for countries to eliminate subsidies and raise energy taxes, because there's less opposition and it will be more muted. It's a tool that can be readily available and deployed today. It's one of 3 feasible mitigation policy instruments that can help us meet our 1.5 degrees target. So this is something that governments are recognizing now, starting to include in their processes. It fits very well with what's been said in the UNFCCC in terms of the various articles around finance and mitigation and transparency, capacity building. And there's a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. I mean, this is the same with subsidy removal, but I'm sure as with introductions of taxes, you've got to help people understand why you need to get the prices right. You've got to build cross-party support for reform, and you've got to manage the impacts of reform. Often that will mean putting more money into social welfare systems and targeted welfare systems. So I'm going to give 3 quick examples. But what would be great is if people in the room from countries that have been through this process or are going through this process would like to raise their experience. That would be better. Morocco's the first. Again, this is more about reform around gasoline and diesel, which happened between 2004, 2006, has been ongoing. Morocco brought in cash transfers, a big cash transfer system for poor rural households, and expanded their safety nets, put in lifeline electricity tariffs, and protected public transport. So Morocco is a good example of one country that has made this shift on subsidies. Indonesia as well, they're in the enviable position of looking at what to do with 16 billion worth of savings from their gasoline and diesel reforms. A lot of it, like Andreas said, with Costa Rica as well, is going to infrastructure. There's a huge need to finance infrastructure. Same in Indonesia, would be earmarked for infrastructure, connectivity, water supply. A small percentage for renewables, but the hope is that it will leverage more private finance by opening up that sector. And a huge amount has also gone in Indonesia into building what some would term a social safety net around one-off cash transfer schemes, social welfare systems on health, a food scheme, and students. So it's a package of measures, basically. But then it's not going. It's been not going into gasoline and diesel. The Philippines is the most interesting. I think anyone from the Philippines, it would be great to hear from you today. It was very difficult to do this, but they removed their subsidies and then they taxed at 12% VAT on gasoline to finance the poor and long-term infrastructure and health and education. They have a great program there called the 4 Ps, which covers cash transfers, feeding program, food for work programs, rice subsidies. So they had to go through a big countrywide process 3 times with the increase in prices that they couldn't sustain. It was very difficult. But then they understood the Philippines started to tax their gasoline and diesel, and they can use that now to help fund these social programs. I mean, we've mentioned here about the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, but I think it's important to recognize country efforts in this area, and this is one way of doing it. If your country is going through this process, if you understand this transition and the importance of phasing these subsidies out, speak to New Zealand and get behind this communique. Thank you very much.
Laura, thank you for that. I'd invite you to join me first of all in thanking our 3 panellists who've given us a great introduction to the topic. I have to say that the reason the Friends countries, with support from civil society, originally launched the international push for fossil fuel subsidy reform was because we felt it was a no-brainer, and I think today you've heard both from both through the policy and through a specific national example of why it remains a no-brainer. In Paris, we translated that into a much wider international call to action. I think it remains very much the view of the Friends that in the wake of Paris, the time for action is now, both because we have the Paris Agreement and because oil prices remain at such a low point. So there's a political opportunity. I think we've heard finally from Laura on the extent to which those subsidies genuinely do drive greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that figure for the potential impacts on total greenhouse gas emissions, if you combine comprehensive subsidy reform with appropriate levels of taxation or duty, potential for cuts of 1/4 in global greenhouse gas emissions is an extraordinary one, and I think underlines for us the stakes of in this area of policy. Without further ado, I think we should provide those of you on the floor an opportunity to pose questions to members of the panel, or indeed picking up Laura's point to tell us about your own national experience. We've heard of several specific country experiences, but we've got a big group of countries represented around the room, and we'd be keen to hear more. So please don't be shy. We're keen to hear from you. Please, the speaker in front row, second row.
Thank you. I have a little question about...
If you'd like to identify yourself, country or organisation, that'd be very welcome.
Yeah, I'm from University of Bayreuth, Germany. And
okay.
I have a little question about the taxation in Germany. About the taxation in Germany, because it was indicated that the oil price is quite high, but the coal price is so low. So is there a tax for coal in Germany? Yeah.
That diamond seemed to point to us.
Or like a subsidy, sorry.
It seemed to point to a subsidy, didn't it? Yeah. Is that the case, is it?
Do you want me to answer that now?
Yep.
Okay. I think this data... The data is probably from 2010. So on coal, it may have changed. So I think that that's another point. I mean, there's it definitely on for Indonesia's research, you can see that diamond is moving on gasoline and on diesel, and that's what's generating the revenues for Indonesia to be having those discussions about where to put its money next. I don't know the exact situations in Germany, but again, these are only consumer. These are only on the consumer side, so it doesn't reflect at all what's happening upstream. And with coal, we know that there are many producer subsidies that are often very hidden in terms of financing for rail tracks to supply coal to areas, or ports to ship them out to other areas, or tax breaks with land leasing for mining companies. None of that is reflected here. So it's really very much on the consumer side. Those producer subsidies are very hidden, very difficult to get at, and there's not as much information about there. We think they're around 100 billion a year, but so that's it.
Others? Do we have others who'd like to talk about? Sorry, the gentleman in the fourth row back there. Yep, please.
And my laptop survived. Hi, I'm Colin O'Hare I'm the acting head of the Irish delegation. Just a quick question about any countries that removed fossil fuel subsidies. Was there bearing in mind that the first immediate impact is presumably going to be an increased cost of gasoline. So was there a difficulty in gaining support for this, either politically or in the wider public? And how did you deal with that? Thanks.
There may be members of the panel who can comment on that, or equally there may be others around the room who can talk from their own experience in addressing the political challenges that undoubtedly go with anything that increases costs to consumers or business. Any specific comments from the panel or others on the floor on that question?
Yeah. Okay. Can I say?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's done from Vietnam. Yes, I think that the idea to to ask the one who consumes the fossil fuel to pay more, I think is a good idea that we can increase the budget for adaptation. We support this idea, but I would like to ask any regional approach to do that, because if in Vietnam, for example, we increase the tax or ask people to pay more for fossil fuel, for petrol, so the problem is that smuggling from different other countries for cheaper price come to our country. It's already happened in the past. So if we can approach this one to become regional, I think would be maybe better for us. Thank you.
Could I just add a quick comment? I know from my own contacts with Vietnam's delegation here that there's been a lot of analytical work done by the OECD and others in support of push by Vietnam to improve targeting of subsidies and to address the issues that our speaker just referred to. I think it's another very interesting country example, with that caveat about the potential value, not least for political reasons, of moving ahead in a regional context. Our next speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. Emmanuel from Nigeria.
Yep.
I'm sure some of you have been reading it in the paper all along. Yes, response to your question, yes, there will always be a massive resistance. We more or less doubled the price of the petroleum resources in the country within the last 2 weeks. And the labor union and others have risen to the challenge. But the reality dawned on everybody, and government was a bit transparent for the first time. Was able to lay the cards on the table and the options. The strike did not really enjoy the type of support that it used to enjoy in the past. And ours is not because of adaptation, it's because of the economic reality. And it dawned on us now that we have no choice. What we are all praying for, of course, is that whatever the gains government is making from the removal of the subsidy, that it be useful for infrastructural development, which is the major challenge for economic development of the country. But it'll be interesting to see how Costa Rica was able to really get government to really put all these resources in developing the area. I really enjoyed the issue of the transportation, most of our car vehicles are 15, 30 years old, and heavy trucks that sometimes when you are driving behind them, you will not even see what is going on because of the heavy smoke. And I hope that with all this subsidy removal now, we may be able to do something better. But we didn't do it because of adaptation, but because of the economic reality on that. Thank you.
The retail price of our fuels or of our gasoline, it's very high if you compare it to the rest of the Central American region, for example. And it's not a popular measure. I mean, there's always a lot of complaints. But in the other hand, you see all the benefits. And I think that also people, they look at the benefits and they are very proud of all the this green image that we have and all these goals that we are achieving in this forestry sector and all these other economic benefits that we're receiving for this policy of protecting the forest. Now we have all this ecotourism vinculated with this forestry sector and all these, and I think that people, they also get aware of all these benefits at the end.
I can testify to that. I have two good friends who are senior businessmen in Japan who, for whom Costa Rica is a favoured destination, specifically for green tourism. And so there is a bit of sunlight hidden in the clouds, I guess. Other comments or questions? Any further volunteers to talk about country experience, because that's of particular interest? Let's turn to the gentleman in the fourth row at the far end down there.
My name is Michael Brossmann. I'm with GIZ, and I would have one question for Ms. Mesa, also from the Costa Rican example. If you would be able to provide us with certain insights on the leadership of the political leadership on this process. So, which ministry took the initiative in bringing the reform forward, and maybe also like with which other ministries you'd have to team up and build certain alliances in order to make that happen? That would be interesting. Thanks.
Well, it's not an easy negotiation that we're having right now, for example, because we're having a lot of difficulties with our public resources. I mean, all the time the Ministry of Finance is always saying that they don't have enough money for the common, el gasto público, the public common, how do you say that? No, expenses, yeah, public expenses. And we have to be negotiating year by year that they have to allocate those funds, for example, for FONAFIFO, for these forestry issues. And we're all negotiating all the time. So when we started with all this process, of course, it was a big leadership of the Ministry of Environment putting these things into the agenda. And now that we are having our climate policy and our NDC, we are negotiating right now with the Ministry of Planification, with the Ministry of Treasury, with our central bank. And it's all these ideas and discussing. And I think that what it's really effective is to come with numbers. When you come and we're doing a lot of research of the impacts. I mean, a lot of our public goes, and we spend a lot of money right now still in the fossil fuels because we don't produce fuels. So we have to import that. And at the end, there's a lot of money that we are putting there. So we are talking about the benefits, and it's part of this negotiation that we're having, but it's not an easy one.
If I could give one other good example, I mentioned earlier that we were delighted to have Uruguay join the Friends group of countries, and one of the reasons for that was the efforts that Uruguay have made in terms of policy reform. Ambassador Mendez, who some of you know here, I think very much led that effort as Secretary of Energy in Uruguay. So he's another good person to talk to. But as Laura's chart earlier showed, I think there's a cross-section of countries from all regions around the globe who have a story to tell with variations according to national circumstances.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, my name is Laureta Dibra, coming from the Ministry of Environment in Albania. I have a question. From my understanding, percentage of your revenues goes to the environment. Did you see any improvement in the fleet vehicles renewal, or in the improvement of the air quality? Because both areas, the greenhouse gas emissions and air emissions, are related and coming from the same source as it is transport. And let's say the taxes are related to the fuels, to the transport, did the money go back to improve the air quality in the country? Do you have any result? Thanks.
The idea that we are having right now is to come out with this emissions fee. And the idea will be to reinvest those sources in transport issues, to improve our public transport system, to improve the infrastructure related to sustainable mobility. And also we're all, of course, having negotiations and also some other strategies and other some reforms in our regulations to improve also the technologies that we have in our cars, because as I was also showing, we have some of the cars of our fleet is very old, and we must shift it. We hopefully will do this shift into electric vehicles. That will be our dream for certainly. But the thing is that we need fresh resources for that. So that's what we're thinking in establishing this emission fee. The tax that we're having right now, the ones that it is in place, we don't use any of that money for these other matters that I was just saying of improving our public transport system. So that's why we're thinking in this new instrument, of creating this new instrument.
I just wanted to come back to the question from Vietnam and link it with the question from the gentleman from Nigeria. I think right now you're right. In Nigeria and Venezuela, we're seeing huge changes. And those fast reforms aren't always the best approaches. And so often at the Global Subsidies Initiative, we've advocated for a slower incremental price increase that includes thinking about getting the prices right, building the support first, letting people know why, and making sure those mitigation policies are in place and that they work. And I know Shaw P was a big effort to do that, and it didn't work. And I think sometimes it's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg with these subsidies, because they're not only linked to the smuggling and adulteration that our colleague from Vietnam mentioned, but also, you know, they're just sometimes also completely lost. And so this is government wealth that doesn't get through to the right people. And I understand that transparency issue very importantly. But sometimes, I mean, often when reforms take place, prices do increase, but sometimes they don't. That's partly because the subsidies themselves create so much smuggling, adulteration, and price shenanigans that and corruption, thank you for saying the word, I didn't, but that the prices in the market are never, you know, and in the black market of these fuels are never the subsidized prices. So someone somewhere is taking a lot of money. And so sorting and unpicking this process can sometimes lead to kind of sort of reasonable prices for the time being, and especially within this low oil price. But I would say on Vietnam, you're absolutely right. A regional approach and moving together is what's needed. And at the moment, we don't have that. We have voluntary approaches through the G20, but also through APEC. APEC agreed in 2010 to phase out fossil fuel subsidies in the medium term. But we need that to happen together, because those differentials can be construed as a problem. So that requires APEC and G20 to move together on this, to know when they're going to phase these subsidies out, and to also start to be transparent about them and where they exist. And that's why we have something called the peer review process that's been going on. The Philippines was part of that. New Zealand, I mean, Mark can explain, was part of that, which has been about opening up countries' books to see where these subsidies are and to work out which ones need phasing out. So,
could I ask, picking up Laura's point about the G20, the reality is the G20 as a group are going to be the single biggest determinant of success in the mitigation challenge. Is there anyone around the room who can speak as an observer of the G20, either from the inside or the outside, in respect of what the prospects are for getting a stronger collective commitment to action on subsidy reform, fossil fuel subsidy reform? It is, I think, quite a critical variable in our success in delivering on the Paris agenda. No takers? Other questions or comments from around the room? We've got a bit of time left. Or from the panel?
I'd just like to add, if you could please, if you're at the end of the rows, there are sign-up sheets. And so this helps us to keep in touch with people and to let people know what's going on. So please do pass those down the row and sign them up. They're just on the end, on these ends. Thank you very much.
I think, unless there are other questions, the front row.
Hello, Julia from German Watch. I have a question to Laura, because now we heard of Costa Rica, a country which is importing fossil fuels. And yeah, I would be interested in a successful example of a country which is actually exporting fossil fuels, or whose fossil fuel sector is also public, and so the government is actually having also revenue from it. So, or if you could go a little bit more into detail about the difference and about the different challenges those countries are facing, I would be interested in that. Thanks.
We've heard from our colleague from Nigeria, and we've worked hard with Nigeria. We're trying to encourage the government to target energy subsidies from a blanket approach to something that can be targeted on women and for energy access. So that's the hope, that some of that money as a producer country, because that's what the question's about, will be better targeted. Venezuela as well. It's not pretty, but there is some movement there, because last year the emphasis was on the consumer side of things, on 2 to 3 years ago, when the oil price was very high, importing countries like Costa Rica were really squeezed and being pushed to reform because their bills were going up and up and up and up. Now it's on the other foot. So producer countries like Nigeria and Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, UAE are the ones who are reforming, because they can't sustain keeping their fuels cheap to their domestic citizen base, voting base. So, and Egypt as well. Oh, no, it's UAE and Saudi Arabia. So basically, that is also moving too, and those reforms are happening too on gasoline and on diesel. But it depends what kind of country you're in. It's all very contextual. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're winding down. I'd like to make 4 quick final points which relate to my earlier comment about call to action. For those of you who are wondering what you can do to help on this very important track of follow-up to Paris, for those of you who are parts of national governments, if your government's not already part of the Friends group, please urge your leaders to join the Friends group. There's 40 countries who've so far endorsed the communique, and the more we can get, the more impact we have in terms of critical mass. Second, I would encourage you to look at joining the NAP's global network. It's a great place to exchange ideas and learn more about the role of fiscal instruments in financing adaptive action. And it's a very practical focus to the work of the NAP, as we heard earlier. Third, we've already heard of a number of countries that have included language on fossil fuel subsidy reform within their NDCs. I think there are more who can and should do that, not just fossil fuel subsidy reform, but also, as we've highlighted today, the complementary role of taxation on fossil fuels. And those can be built into a financing strategy associated with national adaptation plans. And finally, on the question of how, which has been a feature of the last couple of questions, we would urge governments to approach the issue in a phased and orderly manner, as outlined by the speakers today, including getting the prices right, building political support for reform, and managing and mitigating any negative impacts from reform. There's lots more information available on the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy website, along with those of the groups represented at the table today. So dig deep, wallow around in it. There's lots of great information and advice. I'd ask you finally to join me in thanking our 3 expert panelists who've invested a lot of time and effort in preparing their presentations. Thank you all for joining us today. It's been a great turnout and great exchange of views. Many thanks.